Welcome, welcome, ladies. Before we get started, I did want to make clear that this is, we call it a town hall. Doesn't exactly look like a town hall, but this is going to be one of those cases where we want to hear from you. We want to hear some frank talk from all of you in the audience about this subject that I think hits near and dear to everybody in this room. Maryam is Minister of Status of Women in Canada. You were elected to the House of Commons in October of 2015, and you co-founded the Red Pashmina campaign, which empowers the women of Afghanistan through education. And we are hearing from the First Lady of Afghanistan in just a couple hours. Oh, there she is. Nice to see you. Yes. And Kathleen Taylor is, of course, chair of the board of the Royal Bank of Canada. She's the first woman to lead the board of a major Canadian bank. She's also chair of the Sick Kids Foundation, a director of Air Canada, vice chair of the Adecco Group, and director of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. So thank you for joining us. So as I was saying to our guests in the green room, this is a conversation I'm sure you feel like you've all heard. I've certainly been at the center of this conversation for 15 some odd years. I remember interviewing Hillary Clinton at the APEC summit when she was Secretary of State, like way early, right at the beginning of her tenure, when she wanted to make economic empowerment something that world leaders talked about. The fact that it actually, including women in the economy, actually will improve their GDP. So we are committed in this conversation to do some hard takeaways, where we want to take the conversation forward. So, Kathleen, I want to start with you. We're going to start at the leadership part of this. We've got Fortune 500 CEO women kind of ranging around 5%, dropping below it. That dial has not moved. In fact, it's gotten a little worse. Women on the boards of directors of major companies, same thing. Whether it's Canada, the US, other industrialized nations, you're looking generally at about mid to upper teens percent of women on boards. What's gone wrong?
Well, I think a lot of things, I would say. Part of the reason it makes it so complicated to fix is that there's so many things at work when you think about the advancement of women. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's social, sometimes it's economic, can be political, but it can also be structural. And so if you think about the work we've done, I've been a businesswoman for almost 40 years. And when I think about what we've talked about and worked on for all of that period of time, it has been really good stuff. We have made great progress around policies and procedures. We've done great things in workplace empowerment. But to your point, it's a stubborn dial, and it's a very difficult one to move. And so we've been leaning in, all of us, I think, this generation and the ones 2 or 3 behind them for quite some time. So what else needs to happen? I would say, for me now, I'm focusing a lot on structural change. And what do I mean by that? So I'm pressing people on what is it about the workplace that you're familiar with that is causing young women to say, you know what, I'm going to do something different. What are those causes? Because some of them are off-ramping to home, some of them are off-ramping to a different lifestyle, but they're making change in such huge numbers that
in the middle management area.
In the middle management
area. Way before you get to the top.
Way before.
Yeah.
But this is where we have to keep them, because we haven't got a shot at a larger percentage in the C-suite if we don't have them at the EVP level or the SVP level or the VP level. So what is going on there with the young leaders of tomorrow, and why are they making those different choices about your workplace or someone else's? And I think this is something that really needs closer examination, and I think we'll find, if we speak to our young women, that they can tell us exactly what it is.
Give me an example of what you think it is.
Well, this is purely anecdotal, but some short time ago I had a conversation with a roundtable of young people, and somebody talked about the early morning nature of the work and that 7 o'clock meeting, and we started to talk about what that meant. And one of the young fellows, he did all the work for me. It was so fantastic. said how he loved leaving home at 5:30, got to the gym, hit the gym, back in the office, at his desk by 6:40, in time for that 7 o'clock meeting. And the young woman next to him said, I'm making his name up here, Greg, don't you have 3 children? And Greg says, yeah. And everybody's riveted now. And she says, what are they doing at 5:30 in the morning? And that was the end of the conversation, because all of a sudden everybody could see that was actually what was causing. Now, it's not the only thing.
Right.
I have a young mentee who will remain nameless, and she's in a very, very high-powered investment-style business. But she's having trouble advancing because she's not spending enough face time. And when you dig into what's face time, she's not there at 10 o'clock at night. Is her work okay? Yes. It's great. Is it better than the next person's? Yes. But she's got a 1-year-old. And so she's making a choice to organize herself in a different way and try to make a go of it, even with that. So these are tiny little examples. We can get into much deeper ones associated with leave and flexible work and pay. I know we're going to talk about, but there's lots of room there for big improvement.
Maryam, what's your reaction when you listen to that?
Well, first of all, if I can just begin by acknowledging that I'm in this space with some of the most powerful women alive right now on this traditional territory that many Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee Mohawks, have called home for generations upon generations. And I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the government, and I know you heard from my boss earlier, to welcome you, great women, back to Canada for this important gathering. When I have conversations like this, I'm reminded of what I hear from women's organizations across the country, and they say, we don't come together anymore like we used to. And so before we move any further, I see the poppies. Let us acknowledge the sacrifices of all those who've secured us the means and the liberties that afford us the power and influence we have, whether it's those who fought in battles, whether it's the silence breakers whose courage has brought us to this opportune moment and a moment for courageous conversations, or courageous women like my mother who took 3 little girls and said, there are a lot of barriers, there's no hope here, but I believe in a better future for them. And so I just want to acknowledge all those women who've come before us, on whose successes we build ours on.
Thank you for doing that.
And I'm hopeful, my goodness. It's cool to declare yourself a feminist. As a government leader, the head of the UN called himself a feminist. We're having a conversation that crosses borders and languages and cultures and generations and sectors to see how we can advance gender equality, not just because it's the right thing to do. My God, it's the right thing to do, but also because it's smart. If we get this work done right here in Canada, over the next 8 years, we will add $150 billion to our economy.
So let me ask you that, Maryam, because as the minister on the status of women, you're the perfect person to ask this. There have been a number of studies that show women participating as to GDP. There are a number of studies that show that it improves the performance of companies and the value of companies and the innovation of companies. Is there an awareness gap? Do you think that CEOs, people who run companies, are really aware of that?
I know that there's probably a confirmation bias of the people I connect with, whether it's the women's organizations, whether it's leaders in the public and private sector in Canada and abroad. We get it. Adding women and increasing diversity around the boardroom, in your business, in politics, is smart. It makes money. It makes good sense, and especially in this fast-paced economy in which we find ourselves seeking new ideas and approaching new challenges, that diversity is smart. So not in the circles of folks like RBC. There is a knowledge gap. Those who come to us and end up in spaces like this, they get why it's important.
So that's the question, is are we all talking to each other, or does there need to be
that's possibly a part of
awareness?
But what they want to see, if there are those who have yet to be converted, what they need to see is success from the rest of us. So we need to show the how. We need to work with government, private sector, and civil society organizations, as well as others in the public sector, to say, yes, okay, so having more women entrepreneurs is good for the economy. In Canada right now, it's 17%. That awareness gap is there because not a lot of people realize that only 17% of Canada's businesses are majority owned or completely owned by women. So what can we do about it? Do we all just talk about it for decades and decades? No, the government's invested close to $2 billion in a women entrepreneurship strategy because we've heard from successful women like you that access to financing is a challenge. Finding access to new markets through trade agreements is a challenge. Having access to data and mentors is a challenge. So, I mean, awareness is important, but when we have a critical mass, like the one we're seeing in rooms like this, in this moment in time right now, it's time to focus more on showing results and success, and then letting that success speak for itself.
So Kathleen, we had the Fortune Global Forum in Toronto just a couple weeks ago, and one of our breakout sessions was fascinating. It was on the advancement of women, and the takeaway from that was that we need, for companies, for the private sector, there needs to be transparency, there needs to be measurement, and there needs to be publication or publicity around that measurement. Not so much for shaming, but as somebody in the room put it, but for faming, so that you rank companies on their record. And finally, that it has to come from the CEO. It has to come from the top. What's your reaction to those first three? And I know you agree with the fourth because we were talking about it a little bit earlier.
Agree, and agree. Okay. I would agree with all four of those comments. You know, the notion that human capital is the most important input to virtually every business that I know of, certainly is the most important input to the Canadian economy, or the American economy for that matter. But that human capital, the most important input to successful business, is one that is not measured in the way that these folks were talking about, where diversity and inclusion, which we know is a platform for not only greater success, but greater agility, greater innovation, all the things that we want our businesses to be thinking about today. And so for that not to be measured and managed in a way that we do customer retention, as an example, seems odd when you put it in those terms. And there's no question that the sectors of the economy that have been required to set targets for diversity and inclusion in their businesses have made greater strides than those that have not. Part of that is because it's part of a focus internally. Part of it is part of a focus externally. But these are hard things to move forward on in companies, and hence this is the job of leadership, and that doesn't just mean the CEO. He or she has to set the tone for the kind of culture and the kind of environment that they want to be building for their business over the long term. But all of us, whether we're CEOs, executives at whatever level, or members of the board, have to be on that same track and pushing for these outcomes, because they will drive greater success.
So I want to bring in the audience. I know we have a lot of topics we haven't talked about yet, but we will, including the government's pay equity proposal. But I'd like to start off in our audience participation with Danielle Hankel, who's with us today. She's been named a leadership champion of the World Bank's Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative. Danielle, oh, there you are, right in front of us. Offer us some concrete takeaways, if you could, and there should be a mic there for you.
Beautiful dress, just saying.
There it is.
There we go.
Mrs. Ishtan, Mrs. Monsef, Mrs. Taylor, thank you. Thank you all for being here. This is a wonderful moment that we have to share in order to find better ways. And yes, in this room there are so many things that we could do all together. And I will put it very simply. being a champion for the WIFI, which is the Women Initiative, finance initiative around the world with the World Bank, and being an entrepreneur, I decided to launch a TV, it's called DanielleHenkel.tv. And there is one reason, because you were talking about awareness, Mrs. Ishton, and it is, I think, there that we should be all looking into. Yes, it has to start from the top. CEOs need to give the lead, but beyond that, I think it is a collective effort. It is a citizen effort. If the population, if the people don't understand why women need to be part of their economy, it will be difficult. We need to make sure that it's not just the CEOs and the institutions and the banks and the big companies' responsibilities. It is all of us.
Right.
We need to speak in one word.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's raise your hand, please, if you'd like to offer some concrete takeaways or frank observations that we don't have enough courage to deal with on this stage in your mind. Who would like to participate? Yes. This is the First Lady of Afghanistan, Rilla Ghani. We'll hear more from her in a short while. Stand up.
Yes. Okay. It seems to me that it is a different problem. The problem of how we're managing work time, and it applies both for men and women, and that we should have more flexible time, we should have more ways of working and also enjoying life. I mean, this young man who goes to the gym at 5:30 in the morning, this is crazy. He's going to burn out. Sorry. And the other thing I think is that motherhood is one of the greatest pleasure in life. And I don't think we should deprive ourselves for taking time to be a mother. And so maybe there should be some kind of proposal where women, when they reach childbearing age, take off for a few years. And then that they are, because the time is flexible and all this, they can come back and they are received, their experience is not totally lost, and then they take off from there. I remember I had the opportunity of having a meal next to Christine Lagarde. And she told me, people ask me whether it's possible to be a family person and a career person. And she said, yes, but not at the same time. Right. And I think it's really, this is just common sense.
Thank you. What do you two think about that? There's the focus on studies and companies doing better and governments doing better, and then there's also these family conversations that go on. Kathleen, what do you?
Well, with respect, I'd like to disagree with Ms. Lagarde, only because I had the pleasure of doing both. I have 2 children now in their 20s. They're both thriving. They've left the country, though, so I don't get to see them that much. But the minister was asking me on my way in here what was the most important training I received in my leadership roles and in my life at Four Seasons. And the answer was being a mother. There's nothing more difficult than negotiating with your children. And it gave me all kinds of new skills around influence and priority setting and organization. And honestly, I became a better leader of my own people as a result of that I had those experiences. Is it easy? No. Is it impossible? No. But I was fortunate to work for a company that really loved the notion of family. We built it into everything we did. They were very accommodating of my mat leaves. They weren't very long, I confess, but in the day they were as accommodating as they could be. And I was able to, try to figure out how to cobble it all together with a super supportive husband and a super supportive sister and brother and brother-in-law and mother and father and aunt and the whole village. So I do acknowledge that it's not at all easy, but I also couldn't agree with you more, that for women who want to have children, this has to be a centerpiece of your career, and we all need to be working hard to make sure that that can happen.
Maryam, what's your pick?
Well, and when we do invest in women, we're investing in their families.
Totally.
For those who are interested in, filling the awareness gap that may exist out there, that's the argument to make. This isn't about elevating one gender and moving another one back. This is about supporting the basic unit of society, which is the families. And our government is absolutely aware of the care economy, the amount of unpaid work that takes place, and that the responsibility and I'd say the opportunity to provide that care most often than not falls on the shoulders of the woman in the family for her children, but also for her in-laws and for her own parents. I see my own sister doing this. I do want to acknowledge, though, we're saying women, woman, they come in all sorts of diversities, right? Women like my mom, who came to this country as a refugee from Afghanistan with 3 little girls, with very little English, coming here as an immigrant woman who does not have formal work experience in Canada and does not have the networks and connections, and her social support system, well, she left behind for her daughters. She's gonna face different barriers than an LGBTQ2 mom who lives in the rural parts of this country, who happens to be a Francophone living in a majority Anglophone part of the country, who also may have a disability. And so part of what our government does, and I think this is that deeper dive that you were referring to, we apply an intersectional gendered lens to every decision Cabinet makes. This year, we tabled a budget that for the first time applies that gendered lens with all its intersectionalities to the budget, the federal budget.
And what did you find?
Well, we find
Briefly.
that, of course, there are differential impacts depending on age, race, socioeconomic class, faith, rurality, indigeneity, abilities and disabilities, and so on. But there is a way to mitigate for them, and it's difficult work, and the only way that we've been able to do a good job is because the public service kept this tool alive regardless of which government was in power. So it's a decades-old tool. But also because the women's organizations who have their thumbs on what's happening, who know what works and what doesn't, who know the shortcuts, who can stretch every single dollar to its absolute maximum capacity, have been walking with us shoulder to shoulder. So pay equity is a really good example.
I was going to say, go ahead, give a quick plug for their pay equity proposal.
Pay equity legislation was tabled for the first time in Canada's history at the federal level to affect the public service and federally regulated workplaces a week today. And this legislation, for all the policy nerds in the House, Bill C-86, makes a number of changes. I'm the last Minister for Status of Women in Canada, only because the agency is turning it into a full department called the Department of Women and Gender Equality. Pay equity legislation, though, ultimately is about how we value the work that is performed predominantly by women. Great. Do we value it the same way? And so we hope that this will be an important contributor to closing the wage gap. We know that it will make a significant impact, as will parental leave and flexible work times and the Canada Child Benefit that supports single mothers. But we also hope that in the same way we took our cues from Quebec and from Ontario with their pay equity legislation, that this too will have a ripple effect in other jurisdictions where the federal government does not have the same say.
Who has some more perspective on what works and what doesn't? Mics quickly, so we can get as many people in as we can. There we go. And please just identify yourself, and the shorter you keep your question or remark or input, the more people we can get in. Thanks all.
So I'm Edna Conway. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Cisco's Global Value Chain. And you know, we live in a world, quite frankly, where machines are talking to other machines at speeds beyond human comprehension, where devices are monitoring our everyday lives. And yet we constantly lament the fact that we don't have enough women in science and technology and math. I have been working with our government, so I'm close to Canada. I am not Canadian, but I live in New Hampshire. We come up here.
Close enough.
Quite frankly, more often than we go to New York. So the reality is, if we look at education and we change the core foundation of education, we're not teaching our children, both men and women of the future, what is needed for technology. If we do it right, we have an opportunity to change the dynamic, to your point about we need folks at the manager level so they can get to the C-level. We need women who have been educated as young girls in these areas, not because they chose, but because it's a core foundation of where we need to be as a digital society.
Well
that
said.
will make a difference.
Thank you very much. Right over here.
Yes. It's great to be
Identify
a woman.
yourself.
Rolla Daggers, Cisco, Canada. Thank you. Absolutely
Okay.
agree with you. A couple of comments. It's amazing to be a woman today. So I was born and raised in a little town in Lebanon where my father had 6 girls, and he was looked down at, poor man. What is he going to do with these girls? So it feels amazing for my father to say, yes, I had 6 girls. The one thing is, and I know this won't come up on stage a lot, is let's not forget that it's with all the movements that are happening, and it's great to be a woman, we can't do it alone. Don't forget the father that raised you, the brother that helped you, and the friend that, and the husband that supported you. So one comment. The second thing is for women as well that we need to create more of. Once we as women get to the top and be proud of what you accomplished, don't ever forget to send that elevator back down to the women that needs to get up there.
So well said, thank you. I would add to your list, don't forget the male manager or male editor who mentored you. And one of the concerns that some people have had out of the Me Too movement, there's been studies, for example, out of Lean In, where men are less likely to mentor women. They're afraid as a result of the past year's events. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. Come on. I mean, this conversation is long overdue, the one we're having around #MeToo, but it doesn't have anything to do with ordinary course, productive relationships between men and women in the workplace. Nothing. And so we have to bring, I think, the conversation back away from, oh, everything's all the same. It's not. And get specific about what kind of behaviors we don't think are okay, and everything else is. And the bucket over here is easily understood. There's no need for panic and running for the exits.
And you don't find that inside the bank, your bank at all, that a concern from men?
I haven't personally experienced it. Having said that, I would not disagree with the research. And if they say it's happening, it's probably happening. So if that then is true, then we've got to meet it with education, conversation, transparency, partnership, mentorship, leadership.
Great. Maryam, I know you have a take. We have one more question. It has to be so quick, and then because Maryam has the last word here, and we're running out of time.
Lynn Roger, BMO Financial Group. I just want to, you talked about some practical solutions to solving the problem. There are a lot of women in middle management, but they're not there because they have children and they have daycare needs, because men have those needs too. They're there because there's bias in selection. And so if you have a lot of male leaders at the executive level, and by the way, I work for a great company that has put the advancement of women and visible minorities ahead for a long time. But you actually have to make explicit goals when you actually find out where women get stuck. In our case, we found out where they got stuck. They got stuck at the middle manager, a little bit senior than that. And so we made a deliberate step to set our targets on promoting women at that level. Right. And it wasn't because they didn't have the performance ratings, because they had a higher proportion of exceptional performance ratings. And so you actually look at the data, and you have the conversation in your boardroom, and you have your conversation at the C-suite, and you make those things happen by making leaders accountable. And then you actually teach them to learn from differences, not just about gender, but about all differences.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So Maryam, you have a final takeaway you want to give us very quickly in 1 minute.
Well, I agree with you. What is not measured does not get done.
Yeah.
How many of you want to work to find concrete ways to engage men and boys better in this conversation and in this work? Raise your hands if you're able to, please. How many of you want to end and prevent the gender-based violence that stands in the way of so many dreaming big dreams and going after them?
Big A.
How many of you want to enhance the economic security of women and have more women rocking it like they are in this room? Research has shown that the single most effective way to advance gender equality is through investing in women's organizations who know how to stretch every dollar and who've been having this conversation and doing this work for decades, long before we got here. And we are part of that movement, and it will go on long after we're gone. My call to action for the most powerful women who are in this room is to do what RBC did and to partner with the federal government and the YWCAs to help marginalized women enter the labor market, to do what Air Canada and Via Rail did, which is partner with Equal Voice Canada and the Government of Canada to get 338 young women to take their rightful seats in Canada's Parliament, to do what the egg farmers of Ontario did, and to support these initiatives. We find ourselves at a unique moment in time, and the only way that we will take full advantage of all that exists right now is by working together. I'm going to be here for the reception. I look forward to connecting with you. And if you're interested in a partnership that will make a big difference,
reach out to you. Thank you, Maryam. Thank you both so much. Thank you so much.